So true story, folks, I've got a bud who is a total fucking prog nerd. He would die for Cynic if given the opportunity. They're one of his all-time favorite fucking bands. And earlier this year, we were talking about our most anticipated albums of 2021, and he brought up Cynic. And I told him that with all due respect, because of Sean Reinhart and Sean Malone having passed away, and because, Cynic is not known to consistently release music every 2 to 3 years. In fact, there's often pretty large gaps in between their material. I kind of went, I don't think there is going to be a new Cynic album. I don't think there's going to be one in 2021, and I don't think there's going to be one ever. I think Cynic is done, and I'd be willing to bet my next paycheck on it. He did not take that bet, and I'm very happy, because, not to brag, but I make a decent amount of fucking cash. Note to self for the future, don't make stupid bets. I almost lost a pretty solid amount of fucking money, and that would really fucking suck. Especially this time of the year, where everything is way more fucking expensive than it fucking needs to be. Whatever, I feel like I'm getting off topic. Let's talk about an album that I honestly didn't think we would ever talk about on the Metal Meltdown, Ascension Codes from motherfucking Cynic. Ascension Codes is the fourth studio album from American progressive metal veterans Cynic, whose members both inside and outside of Cynic have helped reshape, redesign, and revolutionize progressive music over the course of the past 30 years. At the age of 20, both Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinhart contributed to Def's Human, released in 1991, widely seen as a landmark album for the development of progressive and technical death metal. Styles that Paul and Sean would continue to contribute to and have influence over, with the eventual release of Cynic's debut album Focus in 1993. Unfortunately, for a multitude of reasons that we don't have the time to discuss, it would take another 15 years for Cynic to release an official sophomore album entitled Traced in Air. And after that, it took another 6 years for the band to release their third studio album, Kindly Bent to Free Us. Although in Cynic's defense, they kept us salivating with some EPs and compilations released from 2010 to 2012. And then Cynic just kind of disappeared again, and as the years raged on, what initially was billed as a hiatus felt more and more like a retirement. One that felt especially permanent, shall we say, following the tragic deaths of Sean Malone and Sean Reinhart in 2020. But if 2021 has taught me anything, it's to expect the unexpected, and to expect that the unexpected will come back in triumphant form, which is exactly the form that Ascension Codes arrives in. In fact, I'd feel comfortable saying that this is quite possibly the band's most emotive and ambitious record to date. The lyricism, the overall concept and aesthetic of the record is very abstract, very futuristic. There's a lot of sci-fi philosophy, a lot of talk about the multiverse and DNA and spiritual ascension and enlightenment. There are song titles written entirely in code. I'm not sure what kind of code. I'm not sure what it would read if you translated it, but it's code. It's there. Do with that whatever you wish. Sonically, the album goes in a very smorgasbordian direction, borrowing spices and flavors and ingredients from across Cynic's discography. You've got the robotic vocal harmonies and melodies, you've got the guitar synthesizers, you've got the jazz fusion beats and influences, you've even got some guttural vocals and some gnarly guitar solos and riffs, eerily reminiscent of the debut album Focus, and even some of the material that Paul and Sean worked on with Def back in the early 90s. On top of all that, the actual atmosphere of this record is surprisingly quite cold, despite the music being so colorful and eclectic. It kind of feels like you're drifting alone in space, but all the while you're watching a celestial being give life to a brand new universe. The track DNA Activation Temple is one of the best examples of this on the record, as it very monotonously drones on a lot of ambient soundscapes and patterns before almost abruptly jumping into a very bouncy and funky prog rock jam. even more typical Cynic cuts like the winged ones and elements and their inhabitants can be genuinely pretty dazzling and immersive. It's hard not to look away from the spacey prog metal chaos sometimes, especially when there are so many weird guitar riffs and melodies and soundscapes constantly jumping in and out of the forefront of the sound. Longtime Cynic fans will be happy to know that the heavier influences really begin to pop up on the latter half of this record, namely in tracks like Altars of Consciousness and In a Multiverse Where Atoms Sing. These tracks and a couple more strike a great balance between the more intricate and melodic prog rock of Kindly Bent to Free Us and the more explosive progressive death metal of Focus. Particularly with some of Paul's guitar riff. The riffs and solos on these two tracks alone are some of the best of Paul's entire career. I'm really loving Diamond Light Body as well, which helps to close out this album in incredibly dramatic and explosive fashion. What begins as a pretty straightforward and even minimalistic kind of prog rock cut eventually evolves into a sci-fi spectacle almost on par with what I would expect from a Devin Townsend record, albeit with the flavors and garnishes I would expect of Cynic. There's some really incredible music on this album. I'm not even going to attempt to argue otherwise, and anybody who tries to has not listened to this album, plain and fucking simple. But there are some things that hold this back from being the mind-blowing, life-changing spectacle that it's clearly trying to be. For one, the album is too dense and too abstract for its own good, and that makes it really difficult to connect with Paul on any level whatsoever, which I kind of want to do because in case you haven't been paying attention, he's been through a lot in the past couple years. On top of that, there are a lot of interludes and spoken word pieces and ambient and instrumental sections constantly breaking up the flow of the record. Sometimes, like in the case of the aforementioned DNA Activation Temple, these segments are weaved directly into the fabric of Ascension Codes, but other times they just kind of pop up almost at random, bringing everything to a grinding halt. This album often feels like that scene in The Eternals where Cersei is being told the history of the universe, including why she and the rest of the Eternals even exist, by a magic giant space god. Except in this particular instance, I've really no clue what the giant magic space god is actually talking about, and I'm kind of just dazzled by all the crazy shit he's showing me. Now, that's not to say that just like Eternals, you can't enjoy this album. I enjoyed Eternals, and I enjoyed this album, but I would enjoy it a lot more if I could connect to what the fuck is actually happening. Plain and simple. And I could picture this being an issue for some people going forward. Still, though, it's ultimately really hard, almost impossible to argue with the actual quality of the music here. Could it have been better executed and explained? Sure, but considering everything Paul has been through in the last couple of years, this was almost inevitable in the grand scheme of things. I would still give this an extremely enthusiastic 4 out of 5. I would feel comfortable saying this is probably still one of the best prog rock or metal albums released this year. Maybe not quite Colors 2, but just ever so slightly below it. I think longtime Cynic fans are going to be absolutely elated with this, as will prog nerds from across the prog music spectrum. I've honestly no clue what the future holds for Cynic. There's a part of me thinking that this could be their final album officially, and if that truly is the case, they could not have picked a better album to close out on. It's not perfect, but it is one hell of a wild fucking ride. 4 out of 5. A great record. Maybe bring a thesaurus. Or edibles. Or both. Fuck it. Go wild. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe right here so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.